Hello, everyone, and thanks for checking out another episode of the Logos of Love podcast. Just a housekeeping note for this episode. Chris and I went a little long in our recording for this. The episode lasted longer than we had originally anticipated, so we decided to break this up into two episodes. Part one of this episode is going to end at about an hour. It does end kind of abruptly, so just be aware of that and be prepared to come back next week to hear the rest of this episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Logos of Love podcast. I am here, Kyle Priestley, along with host Chris Barber. Chris, it's good to see you. Sorry, listeners, we've had a little bit of a hiatus. It's been a little bit more break. Life's been busy for both of us. Am I right, Chris?
Oh, yes. Very, very busy. The transition of jobs and ministry-related things, great things. I don't think I've even shared this with you yet, Kyle. You might have known, but I've been recommended for my district licensure, which if Lord willing and board willing, I goes through. Should be in July, so I'll officially have my district licensure. So that's really exciting. But that was also busy, and then also the tennis coaching, which we talked about last time, and still my other job. It's been just crazy. It's been a crazy time. I know it's been busy for you. What have you been up to?
Home repairs, renovations, travel. Obviously, I was in Michigan and recorded the last episode. Last week, I spent the week in the Outer Banks, North Carolina. Honestly, can say best vacation ever had. I love going home and seeing Cher's family and my family. Don't get me wrong, that's great to be able to do. But while it's always vacation, it's fun. I never return feeling like I was on an actual vacation very often. It's always because you were either at their home or just in a place where I've always been from. It's just different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This was the first time since Cher and I were on our honeymoon. We got married in 2011, so almost 12 years that we were away from home family, someplace where it was a vacation for a full week off. So full 7 days away from a returned very rested, very relaxed, ready to face the world. It was really good. As you know, we lost our dog a few weeks ago, and so being able to go on vacation was a nice way to just kind of get away from that and kind of help that healing process a little bit too. So
yep. Just you and the wife. Sounds like sometimes that's
we were with friends and a couple new friends that we met as well too. But it was just again different from what vacations for the last 11 years have been, to have this one be a true getaway vacation kind of a thing. So it was really good.
Sometimes that's well needed. We actually did that this past year for our anniversary, and we hardly ever get to do that. I mean, a big part of that is we have 4 kids, but but yeah, sure. So we did that last October, and it can be a great time of refreshing and time to reconnect with your spouse. And I'm glad to hear that you and Charisse got to do that. So that's great. Glad to have you back, though.
Thanks. It was good.
It's like I haven't seen you in a while. So.
And leading up to that, I'm big into Jeep and off-roading, and spent a ton of time attempting to get my Jeep ready to make that trip. Unfortunately, it did not. I thought it was good to go, and I developed something called death wobble. Not to go into details, it just means when you hit a bump, it shakes very violently and hard to diagnose sometimes, and one of those things. So now that I'm back, the rest of my free time will be either A, working on the Jeep, B, working on the house, or C, working on the house. That's still relatively new homeowners here since we bought the house 2 years ago, and in the place we're just trying to update, refresh as much things as possible. Learning how to do a lot of stuff. I'm fairly handy. Grew up watching my dad do stuff, learn how to do it from my dad, and took carpentry classes in high school and stuff, but 20 years removed from it, to learning curve, bringing it back in and doing stuff, really enjoying it. But it is, I
I underestimate often how long projects will take, and they end up taking quite a bit longer than what I think they will take, especially when I'm trying to be very detail oriented.
That's a great problem to have, the fact that you actually know what you're doing. When I have to do stuff, it's like, "Oh, I wonder if there's a YouTube video on that.
That, but
How to
hey,
fix this thing. How to
hey,
fix whatever it is or"
I, look, I am a YouTube certified mechanic. Now,
Okay.
I have pretty good basic car maintenance skills already behind that, but having YouTube to be able to watch something definitely helps. I think when you have the base skills, it makes it easier for you to watch a video and understand what they're doing and give you more things to come on. But hey, without YouTube, uh, there's a lot of car repair that not just me, but I think many other people, and a lot of home repairs. I think many other people would have to rely on somebody else. And without YouTube, would you really have the fullness of being able to watch us every few weeks as often
Yeah,
as
I
we get
mean,
these out and talk about
I
love
I
and
totally agree. YouTube is a useful tool.
yep,
Useful tool for me to be able to know how to do stuff around the home when I need to, but also useful because you get to see our handsome faces. And that's not to
handsome?
say, I mean, if you're listening on the podcast, that's great, but
Our
maybe
voices are way
sometime.
our voices are way better than our faces, Chris. Let's be honest.
Speak for
The, the
yourself.
the
No.
people who listen to this on Spotify and Apple Podcast, they are way more blessed than the people who watch this on YouTube. So, in fact, if you're
I think
watching on
they're
YouTube, just close your eyes and listen, and it will be much more attractive. I promise.
I think they're missing out. At least that's what my wife says. I'm much more
Our
attractive if they
lives are
can.
very sweet. We'll
Yes,
say
that's
that.
probably what
So,
it is. Showing a little
uh,
grace there.
sort of little grace, and maybe giving us the just, not avoiding the justice that we may deserve for
Oh, okay.
the way
All
that we
right.
present ourselves physically at times. So,
Well, we'll
um,
talk about justice tonight. So
that is our transition, as we said, mentioned there. So this week's episode is on grace. Oh, sorry, the topic of justice and why it is important. Grace and
y-
truth was our last episode. We moved on to now talking about justice and how that is important and how those correlate with love, grace, things we talked about before. So,
yep.
Chris, why the topic of justice then? And why is that important?
Okay. So this one I'm really excited to go over with you all because this one was I would say maybe it was the first paradigm shift when I really got into it. This was the one that I was like, what? If that's true, what about all these other things? But it was the first one that just like it kind of blew my mind. So um, we're going to get into why. But the reason why it's important is not because it was the paradigm shift. It was a paradigm shift because I held a certain view of justice that I think the vast majority of at least Western Christians in the Western Hemisphere, um, the vast majority probably hold to and understand. And um, it's important because, I mean, Scripture itself says that God is a God of justice. And so if we don't properly understand that, um, then we can have some really, I would call them warped views of God. Um, and so that's the main reason why we're transitioning now from the other topics that we've been going through and going into justice because it's very important. God's justice. Some people, and we've said this about some of the other topics, but some Christians, some other Christian folks, have put justice on a pedestal as up there as equally important to God's love, and contrast the two. Um, and we're going to get into that here because that is kind of the premise of our whole show is that God's center is love. So when you put something as equal importance in the character of God, is that justified? Literally using the word justified to talk about that. But is that correct or is that not? And so it's very important because Scripture does say that God is a God of justice, but also because we need to make sure we're understanding it correctly, and how, are love and justice at odds, those types of things. So, but let's just consider just a few verses. First, it's appears both in the Old and New Testament. Second Thessalonians 1:6 starts with the phrase, at least depending on the translation, but basically some of the translations will literally just start with the phrase God is just. Second Thessalonians 1:6. Other
God, God is
translations will
just.
say, yep,
Yep.
God is just. Or other translations will say God is a God of justice. All right. But so this general idea that God administers justice. Okay. Second
Mhm.
Thessalonians 1:6. And that's just the first part of it. We will address the rest of that verse a little bit later. Um, but just that phrase, God is just, period, or God is a God of justice, period. What are we to do with that? Okay. Then we have Isaiah 30:18. Therefore, the Lord longs to be gracious to you, and therefore he waits on high to have compassion for you. For the Lord is a God of justice. So here we get the Lord is a God of justice. Okay. Um, Deuteronomy 32:4. The rock, which is referring to God, his work is perfect, for all of his ways are just. A God of faithfulness and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. So here you get the phrase, for all of his ways are just.
Heard that one. Yep. That's pretty common.
Romans 3:23, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So that he would be just. So when we explain what happened with Jesus and what Jesus came for, it was so that God would be seen to be just. That's pretty important, if you ask me, in the Christian
Yeah.
faith.
Yep.
So that's just, honestly, that's just me cherry picking two from the New Testament, two from the Old Testament, but it's all over the place. It really is. The idea that God is a just God and administers justice is um, is an important concept that's found all throughout the Scriptures in both Testaments. Um, so there's no denying that God is a God of justice. Um, Now, with that being said, when we come to the concept of justice, it's important that we kind of maybe define what that is. Um, so I know we've talked about it a little bit before, Kyle. Like, you could use the, Merriam-Webster definition if you want. The quality of being just, impartial, or fair, um, is kind of just a standard definition of that. Um, and I would say the standard one is, especially, I would emphasize the fairness part of that.
Hmm.
And when I say that, what I'm talking about is justice as meaning you get what you deserve, or wanting people to get what they deserve. When we say justice, that's a very typical type of thought process for the word justice. So that's just kind of the opener. Any thoughts on that?
No, following with you there. Pretty straightforward at this point in time. So, with that being said, the words God of mercy, grace, forgiveness, and love, um, oftentimes those are thought words would be, you'd say, with being fair, those are kind of the exact opposite of the definition of what justice is, then, right?
Right. So, typically when we talk about justice, we're talking about is how God handles, how God, or whoever it is that's administering justice, how they handle injustices when there are wrongs done, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about it. These words are very much diametrically opposed to each other. The word justice, if it means doing, um, what administering what is fair and making sure that someone gets what they deserve, that's literally the opposite of those words. We talked about it a little bit in the Grace and Truth episode, when we were talking about grace and we talked about mercy and forgiveness, those words mean you don't get what you deserve. That's what they mean. So like if justice means administering things to where it's fair, then you're going to get the idea that, okay, you gouged out my eye, so I get to gouge out your eye, right? That would only be fair, right? You killed someone, so God's going to kill you. It'd only be fair. You sinned, and the wages of sin is death. So what's fair is that we die, right? So meanwhile, let's just talk through them just briefly here. The words for forgiveness, the word forgiveness means to cancel a payment. So if you do something and that, let's say that the penalty, it's very, the way that we look at justice is a very legal term. And so, let's use, there's other words like penalty, punishment, fairness. They all kind of go along with this idea of justice. What I would call a very Western idea of justice. And we'll talk about why I'm saying Western in a little bit when we get to the Eastern and early church understanding of justice. But let's say that you do something wrong and the penalty is for, we just use an example from scripture, the penalty is death. To forgive that is to say that that's no longer no longer owed, right? It's to cancel the payment. And so it's literally diametrically opposed to the idea of justice in that legal sense of you did something and you owe something because of it. So it's diametrically opposed to it. And then grace is, we talked about it last week, it means gift. So because it's a gift, it's something that you don't deserve, but that's given to you, that gives you, like if you were in a neutral standing, it's now placing you in a place or of higher standing. So for doing grace, it's upward mobility from a neutral standing. It's something you didn't deserve. And then mercy is the opposite. If you were neutral but you committed an atrocity, and so you deserve a punishment, mercy is not giving you the punishment and putting you back into a state of neutral. Okay. So if you're like, if we're in legal terms, those words, if we take justice to mean what they mean, what it means in the legal sphere, and say that it means you get what you deserve because that's what's fair. It's contrary to forgiveness, it's contrary to grace, and it's contrary to love, right? Because love, and we've talked about this verse before, 1 Corinthians 13:5, love keeps no record of wrong. At least that's how a lot of translations have translated it now. Having said that, I think that that's actually not the best translation of that. It's got the logozetai is the Greek word there. To kakon. Kakon is the word that we've translated to wrong or evil. Okay, so it keeps no record of wrong. But the beginning of the word is logos. It's got the root word of logos in it. It means you're like not logically taking into an account in order to repay. Okay. So it's like not logically saying, okay, you need to get back exactly what you got, which exactly sounds like what we just said with justice is, right?
By that definition, absolutely.
Right. So just that phrase in 1 Corinthians 13, logazetai to kekon, which we translate as keeps no record of wrong. Let me be clear. It doesn't mean that you don't know that there are wrongs done. But what it means is your goal when you address those things is not to repay the evil that has been done or the bad that's been done. That's not the goal. But it's not keeping track of that when it addresses that. So Um, that is a very, very good point. Those are very much diametrically opposed. What I'm going to say is um, what we've been calling justice, and we use the word fairness, but it oftentimes in our Western culture, this gets called retributive justice. That's what it gets called. It
Hmm.
means I'm going to retribute or retribute to you what you did to someone else or did to me. So retributive justice. And that's the term that it's a lot of times when in the Western world, when we say um, we want justice or like something went wrong, something happened to us, and we want justice, what we really are oftentimes saying is we want retribution. Okay. And correspondingly,
Which
go ahead.
I would say, I think that's the way that our heart goes, but that's more of a word of uh, vengeance. I would say is more what that word goes closer to in my mind. Would you want that? You more want vengeance more than you want justice when you say I want the same return onto somebody else. I want I
Well,
want
if
them
we
to suffer because I've suffered. That's more of a vengeance
we'll
side.
talk about vengeance too. We will.
Yep.
But the idea of retributive justice, I would say, is a little bit less severe than vengeance. I
Hmm.
mean, I've heard it in TV shows all the time. They'll say, "I want justice," and then someone will who sees that they're wanting more than just
Yeah.
retribution. They
You're
want
wanting
to make
revenge.
the other person pay even more than they were
Yeah.
hurt. And so then
You
you'll
don't
get the
want.
phrase
Let's
like
say something like,
this. Yeah,
yep.
you'll get a phrase
What
like
you're
this.
wanting is not wanting vengeance. You're wanting what
Yeah,
you're wanting is not justice. You're wanting revenge.
yep,
Two
you're
are
wanting
different
vengeance, or
things.
you're wanting revenge. Yes. So I think of vengeance as even further, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later
Yeah.
because that concept is attached to justice, and we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But
What I mean is, I think those two things can be interchanged incorrectly very often, where people think what they're seeking is justice. When no, you're seeking vengeance more than you're seeking justice.
right,
Yeah.
so I would say that that both of those are very important, and that when you're looking at justice and looking at vengeance, um, one is maybe more severe than the other, but they are along the same idea. Like, I want payback. Now, one can say stopping at equal payback, and one can say, well, because you harmed me, I'm gonna harm you, and now I'm also gonna harm your whole family, or something like that. Like that type of thing. Um, so so I think that you can see though how these are um, the concepts contradict or struggle against one another, right? The idea of justice, meaning retribution, meaning so I want them to get what they deserve, compared to the other one. Yep. So
Okay. So possible contradiction here. So how is this addressed by Christians in a traditional sense?
so at least from my experience, you can also weigh in here, Kyle. But I mean, in general, I feel like many have endeavored to explain away this contradiction
Hmm.
by saying that at times God expresses his justice, and we can say, sometimes the concepts that are associated with that. We already talked about one. One's vengeance, one's punishment, one's wrath, right?
Hmm.
And then at other times, he expresses his love, grace, forgiveness, mercy. But that actually kind of causes a deeper problem. Okay. Um, because if God is both retributively just and constantly loving and merciful, he is always at conflict with himself, like diametrically opposed, right?
Yeah.
So it's like these two concepts within God are diametrically opposed with each other. And so whenever he has to address something, which is going to win out? Is it going to be his love or his justice? And well-known scholars I've heard say, um, well-known scholars and lots of pastors will say exactly that. We talked about it before. God is a God of love, but he's also a God of justice, and he
Chris
has
Tomlin.
to, and he has to
Great is your
punish.
love and justice, God.
Uh-huh.
That's very popular
Yep.
song, and that's right in it. And right there, you have
Right.
love and justice. Great is your love and justice, God. Putting them side by side, it's almost being the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a way that we can understand that that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there are a lot of when pastors and theologians say that, they're literally saying, well, God's love has to be put in check by his justice.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes God's justice has to be put in check by his love. And the reason why they have to make that qualification is because their understanding of justice literally contradicts love, because what we just talked about. And so they
Mm-hmm.
can't think that God is doing a loving thing and a just thing at the same time, because we've just
Mm-hmm.
defined what love is. I mean, we've defined what love is in the past, but for taking from 1 Corinthians 13, we see that it doesn't retribute. It doesn't seek to repay a wrong for a wrong, right?
Right.
Um, so therefore, you have to say that, like, God's at conflict within himself. And that's what a lot of the when I was studying the early church fathers and studying Eastern Orthodoxy, that's what they would say as a criticism of our Western understanding of God is, well, he's very inconsistent. We don't understand, you know, you think that um, he has to punish, right?
Yeah.
And you get this concept kind of, um, if you really understand this concept of what's going on here, um, you get him to be very inconsistent, which is not what we say about God all the time, right? Um, so if God's the problem is, if his love and mercy were dependent on whether or not God's justice is being showed, that makes this version and understanding of love very conditional
Mm-hmm.
and very inconsistent.
Yeah.
A more accurate statement in this understanding is, um, justice, mercy, and love. Of this understanding of justice, mercy, and love is that God is love and shows mercy only when he decides not to be just, and thus making his love and mercy conditional and not consistent, um, which is the opposite of what we said in the agape episode, right? When we talked
Mm-hmm.
about agape and what love was, and we literally defined God as a God of agape. That's he is agape, right?
Yeah.
And what we said there is, it prefers the other even to its own self detriment and
Mm-hmm.
sacrifice, which is shown on the cross. Um, and so that comes from God. It totally makes God to where he can only be loved conditionally.
Right.
That's a big problem. And then it also goes
Which
the
by
other way.
definition is against exactly agape.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other huge problem is the other side of it, even, right? What did it say in Deuteronomy 32:4? It said, all God's ways are just.
Mm.
Oh, yeah, except for when he decides to show mercy and love and grace and forgiveness and all these other things that we know he does if
Right.
we hold justice in this type of manner. Um, then we can't. Um, then we can't say that all God's ways are just because he's letting people go scot free, forgiveness, or he's elevating people who don't deserve to be elevated, grace, or he's not disciplining or punishing those who need to be punished. Oh, great. So this understanding of justice, and I will be 100% honest with you, Kyle. You can tell me if you're in the same boat or not. For a long time, without even realizing it, I held to this view of God. I thought that I had to. I thought that's what Scripture taught me, and so I thought that okay, sometimes God is just and sometimes He's love, and without even realizing that I was saying um, God doesn't love unconditionally. That's what
Hmm.
I was saying. Like
Yeah,
if someone were to really nail it down and say, walk me through what I just walked us through, I would have to say, oh, I guess God doesn't love unconditionally. It's
yeah.
completely conditioned. Um,
So for our listeners, um, these conversations you hear with Chris and I have had these conversations in some way, shape, or form in the past, sometimes more in depth than not. I think this is one, Chris, you and I really haven't talked much about over meals. I can say honestly, I don't know that I've ever come at it from the same point that you struggled with it. I think we're going to get to like definitions here in a second. I'll be able to go a little bit more into where I've kind of viewed it as. I don't know that I really struggled so much with this aspect of seeing those two things as contradictory to each other, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But I just wanted to say that just so everybody can see it authentically, like this is a real conversation that Chris and I have. And in the moment, you're catching some as well too. And two people can have come from two very different experiences, but still years later come to a same conclusion, even though different ways to get there
mhm.
and have updated thought processes and how these things go into. Uh, if that makes sense, what I just said. So, with that all being said, that does pose that there is a problem in the traditional way that these words are said. So, what is the solution then, Chris, based on what you've been through and what many people I know who watched through? I'd say where you come from is way more common than necessarily where I came from in the aspect of seeing it through. What is the solution then as far as correcting that misconception?
Right. So, what we need is a different or better understanding of the word justice that flows more evenly with the way God is portrayed in the rest of the New Testament
Hmm.
when he deals with sin and wrongdoing or injustice. However, while we're doing this, I want to make clear to the audience I'm not trying to just okay, well, we need to now redefine justice because it doesn't match with my view of love. No,
No, no,
I,
no, no.
I was very surprised when this came about, when I started to realize this. So we
I think
want
it's
to make sure we
correcting the
understand.
definition
Yeah,
of
correcting the definition. We're not trying to
not changing it. No,
exactly,
no. Like so many
exactly.
words that we talk about, we're correcting what the misconception is, what the definition of is, and what that means on a bigger scale. This is
Right.
just one of those. So yeah, absolutely not.
So, but first, before I dive into what this is, I want to ask you a question, Kyle, just real quick,
Hmm.
and you can just answer honestly.
Hmm.
Again, we didn't talk about this before, so I'm not even sure what your answer is going to be. But what would you say the difference between justice and righteousness is?
Okay, so righteousness has always been a hard word for me to define, and I don't know that I necessarily can give you a full definition. So I don't know if I can answer your question entirely, but I will try. I can tell you for me, the word justice, I've probably thought of it a lot more as far as on a legal stance, which everything you said very much true. I don't think my mind for really even my time when I went through doubting and questioning things, my mind ever went really to that aspect of things. I've always viewed justice more as things being set right. And that doesn't, to me, things being set right does not mean that an equal reaction is done back to. It doesn't mean an eye for an eye. That doesn't mean justice. And I think that mercy, grace can play into justice because things can be set right without you being facing the punishment.
Hmm.
Trying to think how I can give a pictorial example of that. Um, I throw a ball through the window when I'm a kid. I broke the window. Justice is that window being repaired. Vengeance would be me forcing me to pay for that window and have a window broken of my own, where justice would be more me making that window whole again in some way, shape, or form. That doesn't mean that I was punished equally to what the action was.
Okay.
Does that
All
make
right.
sense? The way I'm putting
Hmm.
that is that do you think that's clear to people what
Yeah.
I'm getting at?
Mhm.
See how the different, the nuanced difference between what those things come in there. I think in relationship with Christ, justice is that while yes, I have sinned, there's things that I'm guilty of in my life. I'm still facing those, but I'm not paying the consequences of it. Like, and God is making that right through His action that He did in place
Mhm.
of me.
Gotcha.
Righteousness, I put it more, I'd say, in a word of holiness. Is closer to where I'm at, being complete in what's right and what's full. If somebody is a righteous person, there's somebody who can be trusted and held up to do what is right and what is good and follow the rules and obey what those are.
Okay. Do you see them as correlated at all?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I think for a judge to be able to level justice, he has to be an honestly be righteous in order for that to happen. I don't think you can deliver correct justice if you're not being
Okay.
righteous.
All right. So the reason why I brought that up, for some people, when they think justice, they don't think righteousness. When they think righteousness, they don't think justice. Would you be surprised if I told you that there's not two different Greek words for justice and righteousness? There's one Greek word. It's dikaios. Well, dikaios means to do what is right, or you could say to do what is just.
Hmm.
Dikaiosune means to administer justice or to administer righteousness.
Hmm.
There's not two different words. They're the same. They're the same Greek word.
Not to pat myself on the back, then, but what I said of to set what
Yeah.
is correct, to set correct, kind of fits with that. So
No, man. Well done.
yeah,
Well done.
okay.
Okay, so
Wasn't
so
trying, just that's what it came out.
right,
So
but people think of them as very different things. In
yeah.
fact, I've even well, I won't go into all the details here, but yeah, people think of them as different things. So a lot of times they do. When I've had this conversation with many people, they're often very surprised. Wait a minute, there's not two different words? Why do we translate them differently? And I'm honestly not even sure. but but I actually really like this A.W. Tozer quote where he's like, in the inspired scriptures, justice and righteousness are scarcely to be distinguished from one another. The same word in the original, meaning the Greek, and I'll also throw in the Hebrew, tesed, or I can't even pronounce. I'm not well versed at Hebrew, but it starts with a TS. I can't pronounce it, but both the Hebrew and the Greek word becomes in English justice or righteousness, almost one would assume at the whim of the translator. That's what A.W. Tozer says. So yeah, you find the word righteousness and justice all over your Bible, and every single time it's in the Greek, it's the same word, dikaiosune, and the Hebrew, it's always the same word. Okay,
Hmm.
and what it means, I actually think um, righteousness at least helps me understand it a little better. And you already said it. It means to set things right. Or if you're just to say, if you're okay, so that's dikaiosune to set things right. To Um, Dikaios, it just means you do what is right. Okay. And both are this is the important part. Both are not really in the Hebrew or the Greek, they're not really legal terms. They're not. They're
Hmm.
relationship words. So it's doing what's right in relationship. And then when someone does something wrong, this dikaiosune is needed because things need to be set right. Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. So that's been established. So why is it translated justice in other passages and righteousness in some? I think it's literally because of what we just talked about. A lot of um, here's another definition. the process or result of using laws to fairly judge and punish crimes and criminals. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of justice. And so when the Bible um, uses the phrase uses the phrase dikaios or dikaiosune, and it's showing how he handles people in their crimes or their sins or whatever phrase you want to use, they'll translate it justice. The problem is when it's used and it's not talking about that. Let's say it's the word justice or the kaiosune is used to describe him giving mercy or forgiving. Then they're like, oh, that doesn't sound like justice. At least this is my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't sound like justice. We'll translate it righteousness. Or I'm really perplexed at why we don't translate it. But it seems like if you go through scriptures and you see when they use which one, it seems to be like, is this seem to be more legal, or this seem to be more like addressing someone's sins, or does this seem to be more like letting them off? And then if it's forgiving them, and rather than holding them to some sort of punishment, then they're going to translate it righteous. And if it's the opposite, then they're going to translate it as justice. But that's, to me, that's very inconsistent. The point is, it's doing what's right within a relationship. So let me ask you, Kyle,
Mm-hmm.
knowing what you know, and you've grown up in the church, you've been a Christian all your life, pretty much. So let me ask you, what is the right thing to do if someone wrongs you according to God? Is it to repay their evil, or is it to show mercy or grace or love? Which one, which way would you lean? What would you say?
There's a verse from Jesus about 7 times 70.
Hmm.
Forgive is what
Yep.
we're supposed to do.
Yep.
And if you want to pull it back further, going back to what we talked about before, we're not to have vengeance because vengeance is the Lord's, not ours. As if you want to go that route too, I would say there's 2 different reasons as to why it'd
Hmm.
be, from a biblical standpoint, no. So,
Right. And this is it's stated to us repeatedly.
yeah.
Um, so First Thessalonians 5:15, make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good
Mm-hmm.
for each other and for everyone else. Uh, not That's not saying just in the household of faith.
Right.
It's saying for everybody. Um,
And I'd even say, going with what you just, the question you asked in there, and again, forgive me if you're going to get to this and this is coming up if I'm jumping ahead on things. You can go back to the story of Cain and Abel at the beginning of the Bible.
mhm.
Cain killed Abel. In our human view of what is justice, what would, I'd say, even primarily in the church, if someone was to murder somebody, what would many people in the church say the just thing to do would be?
Capital punishment.
Kill him.
Yep.
What did God do?
He didn't. You're right.
Not even
Absolutely.
remotely, he didn't kill him. No,
Right.
I'm not advocating that we go to a criminal justice system that just lets murderers walk free off the street. I'm not necessarily saying that. But from an aspect right there of what we would think is just or justice, God in that story doesn't even turn to doing that to someone who committed the first murder. In fact, he told everybody not to harm a hair on Cain's head and to
Right.
not
Yeah.
touch him. Like, he faced his own punishment that was just as well too, but it was not equal to what was done.
Right.
Okay, sorry if I'm
Yep.
jumping the gun there and getting ahead, but
No, you're okay. You know,
yeah.
I mean, there's it's all over the place, right? Second Corinthians 13:11. Finally, brothers and sisters, rejoice, strive for full restoration with one another. Be of one mind, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. Um, then we have Leviticus 19:18. We talked about this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about holiness and what holiness meant. It says, "Do not seek revenge," or "Do not seek justice." It's the same word there.
Mhm.
Or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. All
that
right.
that bear a grudge opens up a whole nother level of things too.
Yep. There's a couple other ones. I mean, some of them are so clear. We'll do one more. Proverbs 20:22. Do not say, I will pay you back for this wrong. Wait for the
Pretty,
Lord.
yeah, pretty straightforward there.
Pretty straightforward. So here's the thing. What we have is God has made it clear that we are not to do what we're calling justice. He's made it extremely clear. So what's the deal? Is God telling us not to do something that He does? So if He's basically said repeatedly over and over again that we are not to administer retributive justice, we're not to carry it out. That's not what we're supposed to do. And some people will say, and you even said it, and there's a verse, and we're going to get to the verse in just a second. Okay. Some people will say, well, we're not supposed to do that because that's God's job. There's actually, I think there's a problem with that too. If we're supposed to be his image bearers,
Mm-hmm.
then what's going on here? Am I supposed to image God and how he does justice or not? But you've already kind of touched on it. Justice doesn't mean retribution.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean vengeance.
Right. And we get Jesus correcting that. Um, you have heard it said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you, turn the other cheek and pray for the one who persecutes you.
Mm-hmm.
Sermon on the Mount, he's making it very clear. I mean, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, you can't get much more of a straight on statement of retribution. Now, there are other verses that do kind of indicate, like in the law given in Leviticus, some sort of retribution in that law. And we're not going to go into all that there. But that one actually wasn't from the Mosaic law. That was actually just a Jewish midrash. It was a saying that was kind of added on. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You're not going to find it in the Old Testament, but it was something that they were clinging on to as what justice was. So thinking of justice and retributive terms is not a new thing. Even the Jews struggled with it, and Jesus had to come and correct it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now let's get to like an Eastern or early church understanding of what the word means. I was shocked when I was when I was in my period where we were looking about when I started questioning kind of how I was traditionally taught to see things. And I was speaking with Eastern Orthodoxy and early church and studying the early church. I came across, I spoke with a Orthodox priest, and he said, "No, justice is how he saves us." I was like, "What?" And then he sent me this quote from Alexandra Kalamiros. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but he basically says the Greek word justice is a translation of the Hebrew word, and I told you I cannot pronounce Hebrew. Sadaka? I don't know how to pronounce it. But the word means the divine energy which accomplishes man's salvation. It is parallel and almost synonymous with the word hesed, which means mercy, compassion, love, and the word emeth, which means fidelity or faithfulness and truth. This is entirely different from the juridical. So he's talking about like the legal aspect and understanding of justice. Okay. And this blew my mind. Now, Kyle, it sounds like you had a better understanding of justice growing up than I did, but this next part blew my mind. Supporting his statement here, there are many places throughout the Old Testament that every time justice is mentioned, it's like it's coming with mercy and with saving people. I'm just going to give you a handful, okay?
Yeah.
Isaiah 51:5. My mercy and justice are coming. My salvation is on its way. My strong arm will bring justice to the nations. What are the two words that are paired with that there? Mercy and salvation.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's read a couple more. This is what the Lord Almighty said. This is Zechariah 7:9. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Administer true justice. How do you do that? According to Zechariah. Show mercy and compassion to one another.
Yep.
Next
Yeah.
one, Isaiah 30:18. Therefore the Lord waits to be gracious to you, and therefore he exalts himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are those who wait for him. There's the phrase, the Lord is a God of justice. It comes right after he says he waits to be gracious to you and he exalts himself to show mercy to you.
Yep. Um, yep. Micah 6:8 is the next one you got on here. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Micah 6:8. Next one you have after that, Psalm 103:17. For everlasting to everlasting, the Lord's mercy is with those who fear him, and his justice with their children's children.
But what is justice correlated with? It's with mercy.
Yeah.
It blew my mind when I was seeing these, and there's more. I didn't
Yeah.
include all of them.
Well,
It blew my
one of my
mind. I'll
favorite
read one more for you, and then
sorry, one of my favorite psalms doesn't say this word, but I think the same concept goes along with it. Is blessed is he who fears the Lord, who finds delight in his commands. It that fear, I think, can be often correlated to with justice is there and the fear of finding delight in his commands, and those things don't seem like they correlate together. Yeah. Yep.
so full of splendor and majesty in his work, and his justice endures forever. He has caused his wondrous works to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and merciful.
Psalm 111,
So his
3 through
justice
4.
endures forever. And how is that? Because he's gracious and merciful.
Yep.
Okay. So with this being understood, this is the point. In reading all those, this is what I want to make clear. With this being in mind, the kaiosune, or the Hebrew word which I can't pronounce, clearly rules out retributive justice because it and its corresponding Hebrew word seem to be used regularly with the idea that it is expressed by and through what is the exact opposite of retributive justice. This is because there are ways of handling wrongs in a way that is just, in line with the scriptural view of justice, but still not using as its motive of revenge or retribution. Because even the Apostle John explains, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just, meaning does what is right,
Mm-hmm.
to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So why is he just? Because he forgives us.
He's setting his forgiveness is setting things right.
Yep. All right. So here's the thing. Now that we've established that, I want to kind of bring it home by giving a picture that I've seen. Now, maybe it sounds like your experience with justice is different than mine. And so maybe you haven't had this, but growing up, I can think of several situations where I felt like there was huge tension in the room. But deep down, I knew, okay, this was right. So I'm just going to give one example, but every once in a while, either my pastor or someone from, they would have a guest speaker in, and someone would talk about a certain scenario. Let me give you a scenario. Um, a man kills someone's daughter,
Mm-hmm.
and the parents, um, he went to prison. He was tried and convicted and proven guilty. And the parents decided, this man needs forgiveness. I need to go forgive him. And they go to the prison and they meet with him consistently and regularly. And the man comes to salvation in the Lord through the act of the parents.
Mhm.
And I remember growing up and I'm like, wait a minute, that's not, my pastor's telling me that this is right. But I've also heard my pastor say that God is um, just. And so sometimes he can't be loving. Whether they wanted to say that or not, that's basically what, and I was like, this
Or
seems to this seems to contradict that. And I could feel the tension in the audience. I remember conversations coming out of that sermon and they're like, well, yeah, just because that's what was lifted up in the sermon, or what was shared, doesn't mean that that's what we all should do. I mean, be he needs to have justice, and so he needs, and like all sorts of different stories like that. I was just using that as an example. They're like, well, yeah, I mean, that's great, that's amazing, and they could only do that by God's grace. But sometimes God
Mhm.
demands justice, as if that wasn't just for what they did. But according to this, when God does justice, He's doing mercy, He's doing forgiveness. And I just remember any time that happened, I remember there was like a tension in me, and I'm like, wait a minute, you can't. I and I have a problem. I do. I have a problem like imagining myself. Could I really forgive someone? And I don't know. I, I mean, I think at this point I can. I better understand things. But I mean, for a long time, I'm like, no, I don't want to go preach the gospel to the man who killed my daughter. Like that type of. But that's what we're saying about God, is that God literally forgives the unforgivable in us. Um, so there is this tension that I think we as humans, and I will say, I think I'm maybe to the point where I could at this point. I hope I never have to be in that situation.
Yeah.
But we as humans don't want to let go of retributive justice. We want to say, no, he he should go to hell. If and again, I've said this before. We'll talk about hell in view of God's love in the future. We will, but you know that that blew my mind when I heard it, and yet something deep down in my mind said that was right. And if it in my mind it says that that's what is right, then that means that's what is just.
Hmm. And I would say on that aspect, I think it's hard for people to answer this honestly and to be able to get to this point. But if you do reflect honestly, at the end of the day, if you, that person whose daughter was killed, if they were able to deliver eye for an eye after that eye was taken out, do you think they'd truly have freedom in their daughter being lost?
Nope.
I don't. I think that kind of shows itself just in general. People, whenever they do get revenge, don't feel don't really ever come to a sense of closure of the situation or a sense of things being set right. You still are always, even if you return eye for an eye, you're still going to hold an anger and a resentment that's going to carry on after that, and you're not going to be healed from it.
Mhm.
On the flip side, obviously we haven't been through this, and most people have not been through this, but I think we all can think of situations where we know we've extended grace to someone and given them forgiveness.
Mhm.
How do we feel when we truly do forgive and move past something on there?
We
It's
vote.
closed, it's
Yeah,
done.
it's
We're not carrying it anymore,
yep.
which I think very much only speaks to what God's intention is and to why he says that's so important for us to forgive 7 times 70,
Right.
because it's not only beneficial for the person who we are giving the grace and mercy to and the forgiveness to, it's very much on us as well too, that we're having that and not carrying that
Mhm.
burden. And
Yep.
our I, our world across the board, forget our culture just here in America, our world in general needs more of this. We'd have way less fighting with each other over big things and petty things if we would learn to be selfless in our forgiveness and
Yep.
not seek that I have to one up. Um, that plays out in so many different avenues, as things as petty as sports, as maybe less petty as politics, and things as serious as one of our loved ones being murdered. From all those levels, we're still
Yep.
called to give that forgive, because we're not going to be able to move on unless we do, and we're not going to
Yep.
be able to be better unless we do.